This is the first of what I intend to be a series of videos that will air monthly, running throughout the year, basically showing you each month what is happening in our garden, what we've been doing over the month, and probably a little bit of a preview of what we intend to do in the next month as well. Now, I've decided to start this in this month of July, which here in Tasmania is basically the middle of winter. It might seem a strange point to start a garden video, but it is really the point at which the garden cycle begins. July really here is month zero, where there is very little growth going on. Now, this July that we are having at the moment is fairly typical for Tasmania, or certainly our section of Tasmania, in that it's been very wet. In the last 3 weeks we've had at least 200 millimeters of rain, possibly more. The number of days that it hasn't been raining you can basically count on one hand, and even though at the moment the sun is shining, there is more rain expected today in the next couple of hours. The rainfall that we're getting here on the coast, where it is warmer, of course, in the mountains, is translated into snowfall. But here, with the warmer temperatures, it's just rain, and what it means is that everything is wet, and the grass is wet, the ground is wet, and it stays wet. It doesn't dry out at all. And while the grass is, for example, looking pretty shabby and really needs to be mowed to tidy it up, it's just too wet to do that. And in terms of actual gardening and dealing with the soil, it is also too wet unless you've made some preparations in advance, which we'll look at shortly. The major job that I generally do in July is pruning. And as you can see behind me with these apple trees, I haven't got to that yet. I've been engaged in other projects, non-gardening ones, and when I have been free, the weather hasn't really been correct for doing it. It's been raining and pretty unpleasant to be outside. Not that you can't prune in the rain, of course you can, but it's pretty unpleasant. So that job of pruning the fruit trees, the apples, really has to be done in the next couple of weeks, and I've really got to get to work and do that at the first opportunities that I have. The plums are going to be the first priority, because the plum trees are the ones that will start to flower first and to move. Now, I know in terms of apple trees, ideally really they're better pruned in the summer or early autumn. I personally find though that I just never find the time at that stage of the year to do it. Even though I often have intentions of doing it, the time just is so busy with harvest, you just don't get to it. And so it gets left to now. And yet even now I'm struggling to actually find the couple of days that I need to get around my trees and do the pruning. But the next 2 weeks I've got to make it happen. I do have a previous video from a couple of years ago on pruning fruit trees, so if you're interested in that you can go and have a look at that, and I'll put a link to it in the corner. My wife, however, Elizabeth, has been doing some pruning. She has been in the flower garden cutting back hydrangeas and also pruning roses. She's fairly, may I say, savage on her rose pruning, but she swears by it and says that it works really well and gives good flowers, and the results certainly demonstrate that when we see it in summer, that the roses have lots of flower and do really well despite that pruning, which I think is a little bit too heavy. And I think most rose pruning experts would say is too aggressive. But it seems to work for her. So there's not a lot of colour though around in the flower garden at the moment. There's one or two things out in flower. The main brightest colour is some daffodils, which are flowering on the roof of the playhouse. They come out a little bit earlier there because being a very shallow soil, it's only probably 4 inches thick or even less, 3 inches or so on the roof there. It warms up in the sun more, and so the bulbs activate sooner and start to flower. So that's nice to have that little bit of early colour. However, the bulbs here do start to move quite early because we are not super cold and have snow. You tend to find that bulbs are starting to come along, and very soon in the next month we're going to see lots of bulbs in flower. Okay, but let's go and have a look and see what's happening in the veggie garden. Here in the veggie garden there's not a lot happening. It's pretty messy at the moment. I really need to get in and do some cleanup, some weeding. The things that we're actually harvesting still are some broccoli here. Now this is not a sprouting broccoli. It was, I think, Magic Dragon or one of those that come to a large head. But something that not everybody knows about those is that you don't just have to harvest the large head and get rid of the plant. If you leave them in, they will come with second, third and even fourth shoots, which is what's happening now. We had quite a good feed of broccoli off this last night. There's still small amounts there that might come in the next week or so. So you can leave them in for a few weeks and you'll get successive crops. It will get smaller and smaller. It's more like a sprouting broccoli as the time goes on. But I quite like these because I do enjoy the big broccoli heads and prefer the flavour of those over the sprouting broccoli myself. But everybody to their own preference. I know other people prefer the sprouting broccolis. We have carrots that we're harvesting at the moment. With these carrots, sometimes you do find cracking and a little bit of damage, but like around here, but they're still pretty good. They keep still much better in the ground than they do any other way. At this time, still for another month they'll be good in the ground. So I keep picking a few each week, and as we use them, put them in the fridge and they get used, then easier than coming out here in the rain looking for them. And also the leeks, we're using 2 or 3 or 4 of those a week and they will soon be gone. There is kale growing there, which has been growing since it was planted last spring and continues to be harvested. But not a lot happening really, and I really won't be planting anything until probably another couple of weeks. I will look to plant some snow peas in here. I could plant them now, but it's still a little bit too wet, too cool, and a couple more weeks won't make much difference in their long-term growth. In this section of the garden we've got the garlic and quite a bit of weed, as you see. Also some broccoli here that I planted at the beginning of winter. Now I probably would have been better to plant that in the greenhouse. We would have harvested it by now if I had. It is coming to head now, but it's going slowly. But we'll still get something from it shortly, and I really need to get some into the greenhouse, which will come along quite quickly for early spring. The weed here in the garlic, it's just a little bit too wet to do anything about it. I will come back earlier in the spring. I know it will grow a little bit as it starts to grow. It dries also, and I'll be able to do a little bit more in reducing that weed. But the ground at the moment is just so wet, it's essentially mud if you tried to work with it, so not a good idea really. Over in this area I've got some area under plastic. Now my intention there is to keep it dry because I'm wanting to plant quite early in the next couple of weeks. I'm wanting to plant some broad beans into that area, and so I've got it under plastic which keeps it dry. It's been under plastic for probably the last couple of months now. With green manure in it, I will be able, because it's dry, be able to come in and work it and still plant. If I didn't have it covered, it'd just be this mud and it wouldn't be really good to work on or plant anything in. In areas like this where I'm not going to plant until later in the season, when it has dried out, I've got green manure growing openly. It's starting to move a bit faster than it was, but yes, that will move along quite well. That's just oats that's in there. I also have another area, as you see, under plastic, because I want to plant potatoes very early in that, so keeping it a bit drier. And also beside here I've got a very weedy, rough looking section which has potatoes still in the ground. I'm going to need to dig these potatoes probably within the next 2 weeks, because our potato supply is running low and we'll need to actually get these out and start using them. In the greenhouse here, it's pretty messy and really needs some work, some cleanup. The only thing still growing here is a little bit of parsley and a few capsicums that are still surviving despite the cooler weather. I've really taken my eye off the ball here in the greenhouse. I should have done more work, but as I said, I've been involved in other projects and you can't be everywhere at once. So I really need to come in here very quickly within the next week, I hope, and get some broccoli started at least. It'll be for early spring, as I said, and start some preparation. Now I normally probably would have started some straw bale. You'll see here the remnant of my last straw bale tomatoes, and I would have normally started some straw bale going to start early tomatoes, but this year I've decided not to try so early. I really haven't seen the advantage in terms of harvest time by starting them earlier, so I've decided that it's no real point. I'll start them a little bit later, and I expect that the harvest time will still come along the same. Starting things a bit later in spring, often they'll move a lot faster and catch up with things that you've planted earlier. So in a way, that early planting sometimes can be a waste of time. If however you do have some heat and light available, like artificial heat and light I'm talking about, then of course you can accelerate things and get them going out of season. So let's go and have a look at what is around in fruit to harvest at the moment, because there's a few things coming in winter that's quite welcome. Here behind me is our Tamarillo tree. Now it's ready to pick. We are picking and eating that fruit now, and being a high vitamin C fruit, it's really welcome in winter, and it will continue to harvest right through into springtime. We do need to protect it from some frost here. You'll see a little bit of damage, but there hasn't been a lot of frost yet this year, more rain. But the shelter that I've got here has really seen better days and about to collapse. I'm surprised in a way that it's survived our winter winds to date. So that's going to be a major project for the coming season, to actually rebuild a new shelter for this. The tree has grown larger, so it needs to be bigger than it has been as well. But Tamarillos, with this small amount of care, or finding a position that they're not going to get direct heavy frost here on the coast in Tassie, are not a bad idea, because they do fruit over winter, and that's, I think, a really good thing, because you don't have a lot of things coming along, and something like this is really welcome. The other thing that's starting to ripen on the other side here is the lemonade tree, and it's got a lot of fruit on, so we're going to start consuming that very soon too. The other fruit that is almost ready to harvest is the kiwi fruit. Now the leaves have finally come off, and it reveals the amount of fruit. This year our crop isn't large in terms of quantity, but it's quite good in terms of size, so I'm happy with that. Most of them are good. From now on I need to keep a fairly close eye on these kiwis, because not only will they begin to ripen, but also you can lose some to rats. I see there's been a couple already eaten, and there reaches a point where you basically have to pick them all to stop the rats eating them. The final fruit that I wanted to show you is this young Tahitian lime, and we've been enjoying some of these fruit. It's the first season that we've had a crop off them. There's only probably 2 or 3 dozen on there this year, but they've been really nice. And particularly when you consider that these can cost up to $1 a piece in the supermarkets here in Tasmania, it's nice to get that fresh, lime taste. They make delicious drinks or useful in desserts or curries. The tree is doing really well, and look, I'd encourage anyone that is in Tassie but not in a too super cold, but in a coastal area probably, to grow a lime tree, because you're going to very quickly be getting hundreds of these and enjoying them and sharing them with all your friends. So yeah, grow a Tahitian lime, it's really worthwhile. So that's a little bit of a roundup of our garden here in July. It is our garden at its worst, at its lowest point, and in August we're going to see some growth starting to occur, some flowers beginning to happen, and a bit of planting going on. So we'll have a look back in August. In the meantime, I probably will have 1 or 2 videos about specific things that are happening in the garden as well. So keep an eye out for those. But in the meantime, I'm going to go and make myself a nice drink out of this lime.